The Vietnam War has been a national stigma for many years in the US, causing much trauma not only in the US military but also in society. The loss of South Vietnam gave away the initiative of the Cold War to Soviets during the 70s and breed a generation of decadence in US college campuses. However, is the Vietnam War really unwinnable? Today I want to explore the strategic opportunity that enables the US to win the Vietnam War, a full-scale invasion of North Vietnam. I know this sounds crazy, but please let me explain it. First, everyone knows that the sole reason for the US defeat in Vietnam is its self-inflicted limits of attrition strategy. Second, the US has restricted itself from invading North Vietnam solely because President Johnson feared Chinese launching full-scale military intervention, like what they did in the Korean War. The memory of the massive CCP army that pushed MacArthur's forces back to South Korea was still vivid in US leadership's mind. Also, China sent diplomatic warning to prevent the US army from crossing the 17th parallel, which falsely convinced President Johnson that CCP will intervene. However, US leadership has neglected the correlation between Sino Soviet split and the Vietnam War, which made the self-restriction of American leadership unnecessary. The US can invade North Vietnam in complete peace of mind without fearing another Korean War situation. The international dynamics in the 60s already disabled Chinese military from sending its army in Vietnam due to the Sino-Soviet split and its internal self-destruction. North Vietnam took an ambiguous position during the Sino-Soviet split, which was simultaneous with the start of the Vietnam War. Because North Vietnam wanted to use the resources from both China and Soviet Union, they balanced between China and the revisionist Soviet Union, so the North Vietnam really cannot expect CCP army's direct involvement if the US really expands the war into the North Vietnam territory. As Brzezinski said, nationalism and geopolitics are much more practical and powerful ideologies than communism. This means that the communist bloc will certainly blow up from the inside. Chinese military strategy already turned from guarding against American imperialist to Soviet revisionist threats in 1962, which was before the Gulf of Tonkin incident. The Vice President of China proposed the defend the North and release the South strategy, which means that China's defense focus turned away from US threats in Vietnam and focused fully against its former comrades. After numerous border skirmishes across the Turkestan and Mongolian borders, both Soviets and Chinese built up majority of their army against each other. In 1969, Soviet military threat against China reached the climax as more than 1 million troops, 20,000 tanks, and 3,000 aircrafts were deployed along the Mongolian border. A nuclear war almost happened as Soviet Minister of Defense Marshal Grytchenko drafted a surgical nuclear strike plan against China in August 1969. The majority of the Chinese army, consisting of more than 80 divisions, 4,300 tanks, and more than 10,000 artillery pieces, were deployed in the north against possible Soviet invasion. The Chinese military began a massive construction of the Dig Deep Holes Store Mass Foods project, which is a network of numerous fortifications, bunkers, storages, underground communication cables, and ammunition depots near the Soviet border. These constructions, together with the Great Famine, the Cultural Revolution, and the failed social movement called Great Leap Forward, combined to cripple Communist China so much to make the 60s its weakest time ever. Given such a dire situation, it's impossible for China to send a large-scale army to save North Vietnam's ass if the US took out North Vietnam only. Plus, communist Chinese leadership even put the threat of a possible counterattack by the Republic of China as a higher defense priority on top of possible US invasion of North Vietnam. Politically, the communists always put the Republic of China on highest alert, since a still surviving democratic China was the only threat against the communist regime's own legitimacy. In September 1969, Four Chinese marshals estimated that their capital couldn't hold for 3 days if Soviets attacked. Given such dire situation, they suggested that Soviet is a much bigger threat than US and China should reinvigorate its relationship with the Americans. This advice was obviously accepted and forced China to start multiple steps of rapprochement with the US. Therefore, we can easily see that US policymakers wrongly neglected the change of grand international dimensions between Soviet and China, which served immensely in favor of US. Both the international dynamic in the 60s and China's domestic problems means that potential US expansion into North Vietnam will not face Sino-Soviet intervention like in the Korean War after 1965. The US can and should win the Vietnam War strategically through a ground invasion of North Vietnam territory because this is the only way to avoid being bogged down by guerrilla warfare and the only way to deny communists a safe haven, as North Vietnam is the logistical and organizational base that supports all guerrilla operations in South Vietnam. In fact, the US already had a plan to invade North Vietnam. The Military Assistance Command Vietnam, commonly known as MACV, developed a plan called Operation Buttstroke in 1967. This hilarious name of the operation refers to the melee technique of using the butt of a rifle to smash an opponent. This plan proposes an amphibious assault on the port of Vinh or another port 30 miles from DMZ, which is the boundary between North and South Vietnam. Then, the amphibious force will coordinate with the South Vietnamese army pushing north to envelop and obliterate 4 Vietcong divisions in that area and advance north to take Hanoi. This plan is relatively conservative because the Pentagon was still wrongly believing the Soviets and Chinese will intervene jointly when they were actually planning to eliminate each other. Nevertheless, this plan can be a good reference because it shows the biggest advantage of an all-out invasion of North Vietnam is that it will force the North Vietnamese to engage in conventional large-scale battle. Such a scenario will maximize US firepower to inflict much bigger casualties against the Vietcong, just like the Battle of La Drang. So such an invasion should be a full success. In a word, it's absolutely pointless for the US to impose self-restriction policy on the scope of war. The civilian leadership of America didn't recognize that the international dynamics had already turned solely to their favor in the 60s. When Soviets and China turned to each other's arch-enemies, it's impossible for them to replicate the Korean War situation to repel Americans. Sadly, America didn't grasp this opportunity, and US people became demoralized and supported massive anti-war protests after endless guerrilla operations in South Vietnam. In the next episodes, I want to explore the technical possibility for the US to win the Vietnam War without hypothetically invading North Vietnam. So please subscribe if you like. Thank you so much.